In the immediate aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination, before the blood had dried or the body had cooled, the American right engaged in a spectacle of political necrophilia so grotesque that even the most cynical observer might have been forgiven for averting their eyes. Within minutes, not hours, minutes of the shooting, the machinery of manufactured outrage had roared to life, ready to transform tragedy into political capital with an efficiency that would have impressed Goebbels. The prayers began immediately, though not the kind one might expect after a murder. These weren't prayers for the victim or his family, nor for the healing of a divided nation. No, these were prayers of an entirely different order, desperate, fervent supplications that the shooter would be the right kind of shooter, preferably brown, ideally Muslim, certainly liberal, possibly trans, definitely not one of theirs. You could practically hear the rosaries clicking across conservative media as they begged their various deities to deliver unto them the perfect villain for their pre-written narrative.
When Tyler Robinson's identity was revealed, 22 years old,
white as Wonder Bread from Utah, of all places, the disappointment was palpable. You could actually watch the talking points dissolve in real time, see the prepared segments about radical Islamic terrorism or illegal immigrant violence hastily shelved for another day. But did this moment of cognitive dissonance lead to reflection? Did it perhaps suggest that their assumptions about political violence might need revision? Of course not. They simply shifted gears and declared him a leftist anyway. Evidence be damned.
Utah Governor Spencer Cox, displaying the kind of leadership that makes one understand why Utah remains Utah, immediately labeled Robinson a product of radical left ideology before investigators had even processed the crime scene. Not a shred of evidence about motive, not a single manifesto discovered, not one social media post analyzed, but Cox knew, with the certainty of a medieval priest identifying witches, exactly what political affliction had possessed this young man. The fact that Robinson might have had personal grievances, mental health issues, or motivations entirely divorced from politics never seemed to cross the governor's mind.
The speed with which the right transformed from mourners to militia was breathtaking. Within hours, the same people who had spent years following Kirk's playbook of treating politics as warfare were declaring actual war. The irony that they were calling for violence to avenge someone killed by violence that was arguably inspired by calls for violence was apparently lost on them. It was like watching arsonists demand revenge against fire. But the true masterpiece of authoritarian performance art came from Laura Loomer, that paragon of measured response and rational discourse. This woman, who had built her entire career on the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that makes Kirk look like Mr. Rogers, suddenly discovered the concept of consequences for speech, but only for her opponents. She transformed overnight into the ultimate cancel culture Karen, demanding the firing, deplatforming, and destruction of anyone who dared to point out that Kirk's rhetoric might have contributed to the toxic environment that produced his killer. The creation of charliesmurderers.com, and pause to appreciate the medieval simplicity of that URL, represents a new low in American political discourse, which is saying something given how far we've already excavated. This digital pillory, proudly proclaiming itself the largest firing operation in history, collected names of people who had committed the unforgivable sin of suggesting that words have consequences. Teachers who had tweeted about Kirk's divisive rhetoric, journalists who had covered his controversies, random citizens who had expressed anything less than complete hagiography, all were added to this enemies list with the efficiency of a Stasi filing system. The website's criteria for inclusion would have been hilarious if it weren't so chilling. Did you criticize Kirk while explicitly condemning violence? You're on the list. Did you suggest that political rhetoric should be toned down? Listed. Did you fail to tweet condolences within the approved timeframe? Your name goes in the database. It was like watching McCarthyism speed run through the internet age, complete with digital blacklists and demands for ideological purity. What's particularly galling is that many of those targeted had explicitly condemned the assassination. They had done exactly what civilized people do in the face of political violence: denounce it unequivocally, while calling for reflection on the conditions that created it. But in the binary world of conservative grievance, anything less than complete submission to the martyrdom narrative was treated as complicity in murder. Nuance wasn't just dead, it was being tried as an accessory after the fact. The right's response revealed something fundamental about their relationship with political violence. They don't actually oppose it on principle, only when it's directed at them. The same movement that had spent years warning about Second Amendment solutions and watering the tree of liberty, suddenly discovered that political violence was bad, actually. The same people who had made heroes of Kyle Rittenhouse and Daniel Perry were now appalled that someone had taken their rhetoric to its logical conclusion. Meanwhile, the actual investigation into Robinson's motives proceeded at the pace of actual police work, rather than Twitter speculation. But why wait for facts when you have a narrative to push? The right had already decided that Robinson was a radical leftist assassin, and no amount of evidence to the contrary would change that story. If investigators found no political motive, it would be a cover-up. If they found a right-wing motive, it would be a false flag. The conclusion was predetermined, only the rationalization remained to be crafted. The exploitation began before Kirk's family had even been notified. Fundraising emails went out with the subject line, "Still warm." Donation pages launched while the crime scene tape was still up. Merchandise featuring Kirk's face and the word "martyred" appeared online while his actual body was still in the morgue. The commodification of tragedy achieved new speeds, transforming grief into grift with an efficiency that would have impressed even Kirk himself. What none of these digital inquisitors seemed to grasp was that their response was proving their critics' point more effectively than any argument could. By immediately weaponizing Kirk's death, by calling for violence in response to violence, by creating enemies lists and demanding purges, they were demonstrating exactly the kind of toxic political culture that Kirk had helped create. They were his greatest vindication and his most damning indictment simultaneously. The largest firing operation in history, boast, was particularly revealing. Here was a movement that claimed to oppose cancel culture, celebrating its attempt to cancel thousands of people. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position would break a normal brain, but these weren't normal brains. These were brains that had been marinated in years of conservative media, pickled in persecution complexes, and seasoned with social media conspiracy theories.
Robinson himself became almost incidental to the story.
His actual motivations, his real grievances, his specific reasons for committing murder, none of it mattered compared to the narrative value of his crime. He had been transformed from a person into a political prop, his individuality erased in favor of whatever stereotype served the moment's needs. The right needed him to be a leftist, so a leftist he became. Reality be damned.
The website's list grew daily,
adding names with the algorithmic efficiency of a combine harvester. College professors who had written academic papers about right-wing rhetoric, comedians who had made jokes about Kirk, random Twitter users with 50 followers who had posted something critical 3 years ago. All were swept up in this digital dragnet. The message was clear. Criticize us, even retrospectively, even conditionally, even with 1,000 qualifications, and we will destroy you.
The final insult was the attempt to memory hole Kirk's own rhetoric. Suddenly, years of inflammatory statements, divisive tactics,
and deliberate provocations were erased from the record. Kirk was retroactively transformed into a moderate, a uniter, a voice of reason. His actual words and actions were deemed irrelevant to his legacy. He became not who he was, but who the movement needed him to be.
And so we arrive at the ultimate perversion, a movement that claims to defend democracy while creating enemies lists,
that preaches freedom while demanding submission, that mourns violence while calling for vengeance. They've turned Kirk's coffin into a soapbox, his death into a declaration of war, his tragedy into their triumph.
The website remains active, the list grows longer, the demands for retribution louder.
Robinson sits in custody, his motives still unknown, while those claiming to know exactly why he acted continue their digital witch hunt. Kirk's actual legacy, division, polarization, the transformation of politics into total war, continues to metastasize, fed by his own death like a cancer feeding on its host. This is how democracy dies, not with jackboots and armbands, but with websites and hashtags, not with show trials, but with Twitter threads, not with gulags, but with deplatforming campaigns. The right has learned the language of victimhood while practicing the politics of vengeance, and Tyler Robinson, whatever his actual motivations, has given them the perfect excuse to escalate their war on anyone who dares to disagree.